Let us go to Luke chapter 9. Verse 54. Fifty-one. All right. All right. So tonight, we're going to be talking a little bit about offense. We're going to be talking about offense because offense for the believer will come. Offense will come, and we have to be prepared for when it does. Jesus makes a statement that, of course, offense will come. So it is guaranteed for offense just in life in general, but especially for the believer. And again, we have to prepare ourselves for offense and make sure that we are prepared to respond correctly and respond in a manner that is Christ-like. So let's go to, again, verse 51. Now it came to pass, when the time had come for him to be received up, that he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers before his face, and as they went, they entered the village of the Samaritans to prepare for him. But they did not receive him because his face was set for the journey to Jerusalem. And when the disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, "Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them just as Elijah did?" You can stay here. So, what we have is Jesus in a Samaritan area, which of course we know the Jews and Samaritans did not have a good relationship. And what we have is they came to a Samaritan town, and the Samaritans did not receive them well. They rejected them. So you have the disciples who poses this statement to Jesus, or a question: do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? Right? And they were offended at the rejection of the Samaritans. Right? They were offended. But what's interesting about the question that they are asking Jesus is it's a characteristic that they are displaying, because there's something that we all probably can relate to, or most of us can relate to. There's a specific term for it, and there may be multiple terms for it, but the term is called backbone by association. And it's basically the person who's silent when they're by themselves, or to themselves, or down to earth when they're by themselves. But when someone or a person or people is present, they're a different person, right? They can be the loud and boisterous one when they are around a certain person or people, right? So it's a term called a backbone by association because, I mean, it's kind of obvious in the term, right? But the disciples are displaying this characteristic now in this moment because these are unlearned men, regular, everyday men in the time that they were living. But yet, because they've been walking with Christ, they seem to have an inflation or an inflated view of who they are. Because first off, who told you that you can command fire to come down from heaven? Right? But the problem with this question is that it is coming out of offense, right? And what makes the offense worse is who they are being rejected by. Because we already see you as an unclean people. And you have the nerve to reject us. This is their mindset. But they're asking this question out of offense. But as believers, we have to be careful that we allow God to do a work in us, because at times we can be bleeding, and that wound could actually affect others, right? It can affect others, those around us, right? So we can be bleeding, and God can have a desire to heal us, but we resist God's work being done in us, so therefore we have a tendency to bleed on others, right? Which of course negatively impacts others. For example, if I struggle with a particular thing and I never allow God to get to that thing and I have that open wound, I'm surely at some point that open wound is going to affect those around me. So we have to be careful and walk in such a way that we allow God to do that work in us and heal the wound so we're not damaging others, right? So we have to be careful not to resist God and resist his process. God has revealed himself in Exodus as Jehovah Rapha, right? He reveals himself as Jehovah Rapha, and he says to Israel, "For I am the Lord who heals you," right? But he attaches that statement to obedience, because he says, if you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God, right? So the healing and obedience is one, right? So I can't be healed of my open wounds if I'm not willing to submit to his process, his obeying him and being comfortable with being uncomfortable. So we have to be careful that we're not resisting Jehovah Rapha, right? Because if God is desiring to heal us, it's for a particular purpose, right? It's so that we are able to be vessels of honorable use, right? So one of the problems I think that believers have is that we have an issue with lying down and allowing God to do that work. We have an issue with lying down on the table and allowing God to do a procedure on us, right? So it's either one or two things that can happen at times with a believer, in that he can have enough trust to lie down, but when things get uncomfortable, you may get up and not allow God to finish the work that he began to do in me, right? But there, of course, there are times as well where I just don't have enough trust to lie down, period. Right? And that is a trust factor, because we can understand by reading and hearing about who God is that, okay, his hand is steady. He will get to what he's desiring to get to if I allow him to, right? He can heal my wound to the point where there is no scar left, right? But we have to be willing to submit to that process, right? Because if not, we are susceptible to hurting others. So we have to be able to have the capacity to allow God to do that work, so that we aren't hindering others or hurting others and ourselves as well in the process. But of course, again, we have to be comfortable with lying down and allowing God to do that work. I think that we can become so comfortable in getting to a place where, or I'll put it this way, we can become comfortable, and when things happen or when we are hit, we go and sit at this lake of woe is me, right? It's this woe is me place where it's easy for me to go. It's my natural inclination to go when I'm hit, right? The way my mind thinks when I'm hit, my natural inclination is to go to a certain place and think a certain way. And our natural inclinations are shaped by sin, first and foremost, our personalities and our upbringing, our experiences. So our natural inclinations are the easy route for us, right? I'll say that. It's the easy route for us. It's natural for us to think a certain way. But the thing about truth is that when I get into truth, God not only informs me on how to overcome, but he also empowers me, right? He also empowers me to win. And he empowers me to be able to, again, overcome the very issue that I'm naturally inclined to. So therefore, when I'm hit now, it's not as if truth is this pill that I take and I begin to automatically respond in a biblical way. I now have a choice to make the right decision, right? I now get to a place where when the thing happens, I can choose left or right. I can choose to respond in my flesh, or I can choose to respond in the way that I know is right now, the way that God has informed me. So I think that we have to understand those concepts, and understand that truth, it has to be applied, right? And how truth unapplied is damning, or truth unapplied is dangerous, because truth unapplied says that in me is something that is resisting God and resisting his wisdom. If I'm resisting the wisdom of God, as a believer, as a follower of Christ, right, it's counterproductive. It's counterproductive to my walk. I have to be able to get to a place in understanding, first of all, who God is, right? I have to understand who God is, not only in my head, but in my heart. Because I can understand, like Job, from a distance, okay, I heard of you, but now I know, right? So I have to get to that place where I begin to understand who God is, and I can trust him even though the situation may be uncomfortable, right? So let's go to the next verse. So Jesus turned to them and he rebuked them and said, "You do not know what manner of spirit you are of. For the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them." And they went to another village. Go back to 55. So their offense led them to ask Jesus if he would like them to call down fire. And what makes it, I guess I could say, how they kind of try to cover up their offense, they include Elijah in it as well. I guess we can go back to 54 so we can see it. Right? Because he says, at the end of verse 54, he says, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them just as Elijah did? And they are comparing what Elijah did to their situation. They believe in their eyes that they have a parallel, right? And what they're referencing is when Elijah was sent by God Elijah was sent to intercept messengers. The messengers were sent on behalf of a king who hurt himself, and he wanted to seek a false god for assurance about his well-being. And God sent Elijah to intercept the messengers to give them a word, and they went back to the king, and the king was upset at the word that Elijah gave them. So he sent 50 men. 50 men came. Elisha said, if I'm a man of God, let fire come down. And fire came down. And so on and so forth. So, but again, the disciples believe that them calling down fire is justifiable because they were rejected just as Elijah was rejected. But it's not a parallel that they have, because their question to Jesus is coming and is birthed out of offense. Elisha was, first of all, Elisha didn't initiate any of it. Elijah is just going about his daily routine, and God tells him to go and intercept the messengers to give them a word, right? So Elijah's calling down a fire had nothing to do with offense, right? It had nothing to do with offense. But the disciples here, they believe that they have a parallel to calling down fire, and of course, they believe that it is justified. And of course, in the next verse, Jesus rebukes them. Because calling down fire would be, well, I'll put it like this: calling down fire from a place of offense is anti what Jesus stands for, right? Because Jesus is not a dictator. Jesus is not one who says, if you don't obey me, I'm going to destroy you on the spot. Jesus is going to give you the option to obey him. And of course, there's consequences down the line if I don't take heed to his word, of course, right? So Jesus turned to them and rebuked them, which is interesting because if you look at this passage, you have James and John, who's pointed out as the ones who pose the question. But if you take Jesus out of the equation, you have two people having dialogue with one another that could potentially harm others, believing that they are right in their stance, right? But it's the mercy of God that will allow. It's the mercy of God that will allow him to intervene when we aren't thinking correctly and bring about a rebuke or a correction of our wrong thinking, right? It's the mercy of God to get involved, to correct us when we are on a path that we believe is right or that seems right to us. But it's interesting that the disciples get to a place where they actually believe that they can call down a fire from heaven because of their offense. We have to be careful not to lead with our flesh, is what I'm trying to get to. Because in leading with our flesh, again, we will only begin to hurt people, right? We can't do things God's way without God. We can't do things God's way without the surrenderance and submission to Him and His ways, right? And of course, because the disciples are in their flesh, Jesus turns to them and rebukes them, right, for their request. Because again, He says, you don't even know what manner of spirit you are of, right? They are oblivious to what spirit that they're operating in. Wow. And one of the main problems that the disciples have here is that in calling fire down, they want to prove who they are or who Jesus is by calling down fire, which is a problem because God doesn't operate, of course, in that manner. God doesn't operate in a manner of providing or meeting the requirements of miracles in order for someone to believe, right? God is never in the business of providing quote unquote proof so someone could believe, but He is in the business of providing evidence so that we would believe. For example, you wouldn't find in Scripture places where Jesus specifically says, "I am God," right? You wouldn't find specifically that verbiage in Scripture. And the reason being is because when Jesus spoke and He would mention things that pointed to who He was pointing to the evidence that they already had. So God never operates on the basis of proof, but He operates on evidence, because the evidence always aligns to show you who He is versus miracles. Miracles have had very little effect as you read the Bible, right? Miracles have a very little effect. Miracles has the wow factor to it, but it never changes individuals, right? Which is very interesting too, because and another reason why I say that the evidence is a path that God takes is because, for another example, I would say you have the story of the rich man and Lazarus. Of course, Lazarus goes to heaven. The rich man goes to hell, and the rich man says to Jesus, because of course he's in torment, he says to Jesus, "Let me at least go and tell my brothers," right? "Let me at least go tell my brothers so they wouldn't come to this place." But Jesus, because he doesn't work through miracles, right? In that sense, He doesn't work through miracles in that sense. He says, no, they have the law and the prophets. They have the evidence that points them in the correct direction so they can make the correct decision. The miracle work would be is to send him back to his brothers. Another example. Jesus appears to 500 people after His resurrection. This is a miracle, right? To appear to more than 500 people after His resurrection. But when we get to Pentecost, we only find 120 people in the upper room. Miracles, in reference to the human heart, does very little for it, right? Which is why God always operates on an evidence base versus providing proof, right? Right? You have people, oh God, prove to me who you are, but the evidence is already here, right? Wow. Wow. So in essence, we have to be spirit-led in our walk, and we have to walk in a manner that we are taking heed according to the process that God has for us individually, right? Jesus makes a statement that you can do nothing without me. You can do nothing without me. And essentially, because it's funny how he makes the statement that you can do nothing without me, but at the same time, he will allow us to function, right? If we begin to move in a different direction, he allows us to function, right? For example, you have the Laodicean church, right, who's having service, but yet Jesus is knocking at the door, right? They're having service, and Jesus is knocking at the door. Jesus is not there, and service is ongoing, right? So Jesus says, you can do nothing without me, but yet he allows us to function, right? So the believer in functioning without Christ is essentially a plug-in device without an electrical socket, right? A useless device at the end of the day. Without an electrical socket, we are useless, right? But interestingly enough, though, speaking of the Laodicean church, I guess we can turn there real quick. Revelation chapter 3, verse 17. And we'll come back to Luke. Let's go to 3. Okay. Go back to 14. And to the angel of the church of the Laodiceans write, these things says the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the beginning of the creation of God. I know your works, that you are neither neither cold nor hot, and I could wish that you were cold or hot. So then, because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I will vomit you out of my mouth. Because you say, I am rich, have become wealthy, and have need of nothing, and do not know that you are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. You can stay there. The Laodicean church, again, as we mentioned, they are functioning, obviously, of course, without Christ. And as you can see, their self-diagnosis is worrisome, to say the least, right? Because the view of themselves is that they are rich. When Jesus says they're poor, they become wealthy, and they have need of nothing, when Jesus says that they are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. Right? So it's when Jesus says, without me you can do nothing, the danger of that is we begin at some point to depart from him and begin to operate in our own flesh. This is the outcome, right? This is the outcome, because walking in the manner of my own flesh will not get me to the promised land. It will not get me to his promises, I would say. And this is the outcome of someone who is operating apart from him, right? So this is why Jesus makes the statement. But let's go back to Luke chapter 7, or 9, Luke chapter 9, verse 55. All right. So Jesus is, I would say, the Spirit of God's ministry has to be alive and active in the life of the believer, and we have to be, again, mindful in that we are walking in the Spirit, right? Because the last thing that we want as a believer is to displease God. But it's going back to Luke chapter 9, verse 55, you have this offense that's going on with the disciples here, and they are, again, having discussions among themselves, this is why they bring the question to Jesus. And again, it's the mercy of God that Jesus is there, and of course in the application to us today, how Jesus gets involved. And there's a danger to receiving or having conversations and receiving counsel from individuals that are unstable, right? There's a danger in that, because if one individual is off in their view on a particular topic, or how they should move in a particular topic, and they're reaching out for counsel to another individual who's off on the same topic, they're only strengthening one another in their beliefs, right? They're only strengthening one another in their wrongness, I would say. And it's only the mercy of God that intervenes to break this up, to of course provide correction to the individual. But again, when we are offended, we have to get to the place where we begin to respond correctly and not go back to that old place to where we are comfortable going to. It's a matter of being uncomfortable and allowing God to do that work, that we are able to make the right decision, so that we are able to overcome. Where offense, of course, will always have its sting, but it doesn't have to lead me back to the same place that I always used to go to, right? Let's go to 2 Peter chapter 1. Verse 4. Because in regards to offense and overcoming offense, there has to be some application in order for us to get to a place where we are responding biblically, right? And Peter, I said 2 Peter, okay. Yeah, Peter gives us a few nuggets here, which I believe is helpful to the believer that they would overcome. In verse 4, he says, well, I guess we can go back to verse 3. As having divine power has given us to all things that pertain to life and godliness, through the knowledge of him who called us by the glory and virtue, by which have been given to us exceedingly great and precious promises, that through these may be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. Next verse. But also for this very reason, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge self-control, to self-control perseverance, and to perseverance godliness, right? And to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness love, right? For if these things are yours and abound, you will be neither barren nor unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. Right? For he who lacks these things is short-sighted, even to blindness, and has forgotten that he was cleansed from his old sins. Therefore, brethren, be even more diligent to make your call and election sure. For if you do these things, you will never stumble. You can stop there. So Peter points out to these particular things that we have to add to our faith, which is a concept that, again, these things don't happen automatically. We have to be intentional about our faith, and a part of that is having a sober mind, right? It's having a sober mind, and a sober mind is something that we actually have to be, again, intentional about and keeping our mind sober, because the mind is something that if you allow something to, or I would say if you are pondering on something over time, it makes its way down to the heart, right? So if we are pondering on things that are not fruitful, then we should expect, unfruitful responses, right? Which is why we have to be able to meditate on things that are fruitful and add to our faith these virtues, right? So I just wanted to point out this in Peter, in that it's an intentional work that we are adding these things to our faith through circumstances which God is maneuvering, right? So let's go to Mark chapter 7, verse 26. Go to 24, verse 24. All right. And from there he arose and went to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And he entered a house and wanted no one to know it, but he could not be hidden. For a woman whose young daughter had an unclean spirit heard about him, and she came and fell at his feet. Stop right there for a second. So we have a Syrophoenician woman who has heard about Jesus in a place where Jesus had no desire to be found. Right? 26. The woman was a Greek, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. But Jesus said to her, "Let the children be filled first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to little dogs." And she answered and said to him, "Yes, Lord, yet even the little dogs under the table eat from the children's crumbs." Let's go to Matthew chapter 11. Because in Matthew chapter 11, there's a second account. I'm sorry, chapter 15, verse 21. Then Jesus went out from there and departed to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a woman of Canaan came from that region and cried out to him, saying, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely demon-possessed." Pause right here. So, we have a woman whose daughter is severely demon-possessed coming to Christ, right? And what tips off this woman as being a woman of faith is she calls Jesus by a messianic term, Son of David, right? Son of David is a messianic term, right? So she calls Jesus by this term, Son of David, which means that she sees Jesus for who he is, right? So, next verse. But he answered her not a word. This is the first blow to the Syrophoenician woman, right? Because she comes to Christ, she's pleading with him that her daughter is severely demon-possessed, and Jesus doesn't reply to her, right? He doesn't answer her. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she cries out after us." Meaning she's crying out aloud. She's crying out aloud, and she's annoying them. Verse 24. But he answered and said, "I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Then she came and worshipped him, saying, "Lord, help me." But he answered and said, "It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to little dogs." You can stop there. So here we have a woman who is pleading to Jesus that she needs help, right? Because obviously this woman is distraught, and I think one of the things that isn't taken into account is that not only is this woman's daughter is demon-possessed, but there are cultural ramifications for having a demon-possessed daughter, right? So it's not only that her daughter is demon-possessed, but her daughter being demon-possessed is affecting a multitude of areas in her life, right? Because remember, this is a culture that would say for someone who has a demon-possessed child, what was your sin that would allow this to happen to your child, right? So there were social things that a woman would have to go through in a situation like this. So this woman is pleading to Jesus, and he doesn't answer her. And then on top of that, the disciples turn to Jesus and say, send her away, right? But what a lot of people believe is the biggest blow is this verse, because he says, he's seemingly calling her a dog, right? But the term that Jesus used here, as we see in here, is little dogs. It's a Greek word, kanarion. Kanarion is a little puppy or a house dog or a domesticated dog. What we see in Scripture when the term dog is used in a negative light is a Greek word called kaion. It's like K-Y-O-N. And that can mean dog, but it also can mean an impure man or an impudent man. So it's a person that would be looked at as defiled, right? But Jesus doesn't use that term here. He uses a domesticated dog or a house dog, right? So in reading so a lot of people have a problem because they believe that Jesus is insulting her by calling her a dog. But essentially, what Jesus is saying to her is that the emphasis on what, I'll say this, the emphasis on what Jesus is talking about is, it's not only the pecking order of who's being fed, because he's referencing the children's bread, but there's a pecking order of who's going to be taken care of in the house, right? Which means that, again, going back to the previous verse, or the 24, right? He says, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, which means that it's not your turn yet, right? Because this woman, because she is a Syrophoenician woman, she's on the outside, she's a Gentile. So Jesus' ministry is to the Jews first and then to the Gentiles, right? Right? So his ministry is focused on the Jews, and then at a certain point, he's going to turn his face towards the Gentiles. And he's informing her this, and she's constantly pressing she's constantly pressing through what seemingly is rejection, right? So he uses that term, again, little puppy, not in a reference to calling her an animal, but in reference to who is being taken care of inside the house. Because the children will be taken care of first, and then the animal will be taken care of second, right? So go to verse 25. So she came to him and worshiped him, saying, Lord, help me. 26. He answered her and said, it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs. 27. And she said, yes, Lord, yet even the little dogs eat the crumbs which fall from their master's table. Right? You can stay there. So her response to Jesus, after being seemingly ignored, right? Seemingly ignored, she continues to press us through, which is a concept of prayer for the believer, right? Because there are times where God is not there, right? It seems as if God is not hearing me, right? But this can be God working on my character, or God working on me individually to have me continually press through and bypass my feelings. Right? Right? Because at times when we feel like God is not hearing us, it can allow us to have this attitude with God or turn away and go back to a place where it feels like it's useless to continue to pray, right? But Jesus is getting to a certain concept here in that it's not that Jesus did not want to be found by anyone, because this woman had a divine appointment, right? This woman had a divine appointment, so that Jesus, knowing that he wanted to not be found by anyone, this woman just so happened to hear about Jesus and therefore make her way to him. This was a sovereignty moment, right? And this was a sovereignty moment, and I guess a reference could be like in Ruth, right? Where you have the sovereignty of God written it's all through it, but yet the name of God is not mentioned, right? It's in similar fashion, this woman, sovereignty is on display in that she hears about Jesus and then makes her way, even though Jesus doesn't want to be found. So Jesus is setting the stage for this woman's faith to be put on display, right? So Jesus is setting up the stage for this woman's faith to be put on display, not only for her, but for those who are witnessing this happen, right? And even, of course, to the disciples, because disciples yet find themselves in a position again where they are having an encounter with someone who they don't necessarily agree with or they don't like, right? Because she's a Syrophoenician woman and she's a Canaanite, right? From the land of Canaan. So Jesus is setting the stage for this woman's faith. So in verse 27 here, in response to Jesus, she says, well, I guess let's read 26 again. Because as she's pressing through these blows that she's getting, in verse 26, it says, but he answered and said, it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to little dogs. Right? And her reply to him, she says, yes, Lord, yet even the little dogs eat the crumbs which fall from the master's table. You can stay here in verse 27. So essentially, what this woman is saying is that I know that the table has not been set up for me, but that still doesn't block me from being blessed in this moment, because even those dogs that attend the table are blessed from what was put on the table. So this woman bypassed the natural and understood what Jesus was saying to her. She was willing, the crumbs was satisfactory to her. Her humility was on display. The crumbs were sufficient for me. The crumbs at the table are sufficient for me. God, just give me the crumbs.